Hello folks, the Why Guy here again. Welcome to my home on this semi-warm spring day. I appreciate you tuning in. Hey, the name of this video is called The Why Guy Exposes the Lie About the Wrath of God. You know, whenever I run into things that just doesn't add up, that just doesn't click, click in here, you've got to investigate those things and show no fear. Never show fear when you look at some of this stuff that's out there, this indoctrination and these doctrines of men that have been pushed upon people for centuries. You need to investigate them with, like I said, with no fear. And some of the discrepancies that I run into, I judge those discrepancies. I judge them by the very character of God, by the very nature of God, according to the very scriptures that are used and abused. Some of those scriptures don't abuse God whatsoever, and primarily the one is God is love, and then some will just water that down and say, well, love doesn't mean, and then they'll come up with all sorts of things, to make excuses why. You'll understand why I'm coming against certain beliefs, okay, in this video. I hope, gosh, that made sense a little bit. Anyway, other discrepancies, too, that I run into are the fruit of the Spirit. If what you happen to read, believe, or see, or taught, or whatever doesn't line up with the fruit of God's Spirit, if it doesn't bring out in you that fruit, then you need to re-examine some of those ideas and those beliefs and what have you, okay? And some of the technical discrepancies that I run into is just, for an example, like I said, the video is called The Lie About the Wrath of God, exposes this lie about the wrath of God. For instance, in the word wrath in the New American Standard Bible, it's mentioned 37 times, yet in the NIV it's only mentioned 29. All right, and then in the Revised, it's mentioned 36, and in the New Revised, it's only 35. One of those wraths went bye-bye. Now, this in the King James Bible, however, it's mentioned 46 times, more than all of them combined. And in the New King James Bible, it actually confirms it and mentions it 46 times, the exact same amount of times. And to go off on just a little bit of a side note here, which I find just almost hilarious in a sad way, oxymoron, is the word hell in the King James Bible is listed 54 times. We're talking about in the whole Bible. I'm sorry, before I didn't mention wrath, I just brought up how many times it's mentioned in the New Testament only. But now when I'm mentioning hell, I'm referring both Old and New, just to give an example. It's mentioned 54 times, hell, which is kind of interesting, 23 times in the New Testament, I believe. And yet, Jews don't believe in hell, and yet they say all those other times was in the Old Testament, but let's not chase that rabbit. But hell mentioned 54 times in the King James, yet the New King James mentions it only 32 times in the whole Bible. What the hell happened to all those hells? Okay, pun intended. Now, whenever I run into those kind of discrepancies, it causes me to re-examine. Now, again, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a language expert, I'm not none of the above. But when you look at stuff on the computer, you can't believe the first one that comes up. And the Greek lexicons, you find two or three that agree with each other. And you know what? You're doing pretty good. And that's precisely what I do here, folks. Now, whenever they bring up definitions, like let's define wrath real quick here. Usually the first word is that defines it, because there's numerous words that define a single word in all languages, Greek, Hebrew, Latin. But the first one that's used is usually the one that's used the most often. And then the second word is used, not quite as often. And the third, and so on and so forth. It digresses that way. Well, when it comes to the word wrath, the first word used to describe wrath is anger, then rage, then fury. And yet, what word is used to substitute is the word indignation oftentimes, and that's why there's a discrepancy in some of these Bibles. Not much of one, and you'll understand why. But the first three words used for indignation is resentment, umbrage, and affront. Do you see a difference between those two words? Let's look at them again. Wrath is anger, rage, fury, and yes, I said it with an elevated voice on purpose, because it requires that. But yet the first three for indignation is resentment, umbrage, and affront. If you can't see the big difference there, folks, there really is, and yet they're interchanged? Really? I see right there, that's a discrepancy that just makes me go, huh? I need to look into this further. So, I looked into it further. Here on this whiteboard, if you can see there, it says wrath. Do you see the word wrath in the Greek? I guess you guys can see that just fine. Do you see it almost pronounced like orgy, almost, but I think it's orgay or something like that. And then if you look at the word indignation, it looks completely, totally different. It is a totally different Greek word, and yet they're interchanged. Really? Okay. Let's look at it in a verse that just gets my goat. This is by far some of the worst examples, or actually it's the best example I can use, but the worst example of how an agenda has been proven. I can prove an agenda was taking place when this verse was written, or I should say translated into English. Romans 5:9, just the very last sentence of Romans 5:9 says, saved from the wrath of God through him. Through who? Through Christ. So what it's saying is we are saved from God's anger through Christ. We are saved from God's rage through Christ. We are saved from God's fury through Christ. And most Christians will go, yeah, that sounds right. That sounds like that's good to me. You know, folks, this is by far the worst understanding of God's nature that I've ever seen exposed in the Bible. And it's the worst mistranslation. I don't even want to be that kind. There's an insertion here that's been put in here that was never there before for a reason, to cause people to have fear. This is the worst doctrine of men, I think, that exists in the entire Bible. Even more so than hell, that bogus doctrine. This is even worse than that. Because, you know, it's an affront to God's very nature. It slaps him square in the face, and yes, he's big enough to defend himself, and I don't need to. I understand that. Okay, see, God has, I don't believe, in my opinion, that God ever has meant wrath in the context, the way it is in this scripture, in this verse, and that Christians are taught that context. God never meant that, because in our modern culture and the doctrines of men, wrath is defined this way. This is modern rather than the one I previously defined, okay? Strong, one says strong, stern, a fierce anger, deeply resentful. That really sounds like God to me, huh? I'm being sarcastic on purpose. Number 2, vengeful, or punishment as a consequence of that anger. Now, some will say, well, God says that vengeance is mine, saith God. You know, also the same verses, or I should say the same Bible says that God punishes those he loves, too. You know, I don't want to chase that. All right, now, is this really how you view God? Okay, is it really? This verse that I read? Now let's read this verse again. I'm going to read the verse in its entirety, in these two verses, Romans 5:8-9, of how Christians are taught that it's read. And then I'm going to read it to you in the Greek, and it's going to blow you away. All right? But God demonstrates his own love. What's the context? His love. All right? And it's backed up later on. God demonstrates his own love towards us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He did what? Because of the context of God's love. Whoa. Christ died for us, much more than having now been justified. We're justified how? Because of his love. Do you see the context? Justified by his blood. We shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. Don't you see a problem here, folks, whatsoever? That we need to be saved from what are they? The anger of God through Christ. We need to be saved from God's fury through Christ. We need to be saved from God's rage through Christ. And yet all the above is really what the context is. And this brought a red flag up in me. All right? And you see, you do your investigation on this, and you see if I'm wrong here. There's a huge problem with this verse, folks. The two little words of God doesn't exist in the Greek. Not at all. Somebody threw it in there. Why? Because that somebody had an agenda that wanted people to fear God. Okay? It just doesn't exist. Prove me wrong. You look in your own Greek Bibles. You look at any lexicon you want in Romans 5:9, and of God it's not in there. Double dog, dare you, okay? Anyway, the word indignation is always used in the Greek. For far as I could find, and I could be wrong in this, I couldn't find the word wrath. But you know what? if this Bible has been so horribly misaligned with this one verse talking about the wrath of God in this one verse, and of God doesn't exist in this one verse, for sure, it doesn't exist. How many other verses doesn't it really exist in? You see, that causes me now to question. I can't help it because a precedence has been laid. That causes me to question. You know what? When you read this in the Greek, you're going to find out it has nothing to do with God. It's all about us as far as wrath or indignation. It's all about us. It's all about our own indignation. It's all about our own wrath that we carry throughout life. That, we need to be saved from that. Wrath, I should say, in the Greek, wrath or indignation pretty much means an over-the-top, they even use the word violent for the word extreme, but it's an over-the-top extreme or over-the-top violent passion. Okay? Now, let's read the verse in context. Not in context, but let's read it in the proper understanding of violent passions. And it reads like this in the Greek. It says, "But God demonstrates his own love towards us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from our own violent passions through him." That's what it really says, folks, because it goes beautifully in the context is because of God's love. And you know what? In closing, isn't our violent passions, isn't that what causes wars? Isn't that what causes adultery against our spouses, things like that? Our violent passions causes jealousy and anger and rage. Oh, gee, there's where those words come in. Do you see? Does this not fit what mankind really needs to be saved from? We need to be saved from ourselves, folks. We need to be saved from those violent passions that's within us through the work of Christ. We don't need to be saved from God. How ridiculous is that? And I used to believe that stuff. I can't believe it. I'm embarrassed. Anyway, folks, look me up on Facebook under the group called The Why Guy. Also, I have an avatar name of Jonathan Jones. Please, on this YouTube, consider subscribing and or leaving a thumbs up, thumbs down. If you're going to leave a thumbs down, be polite about any comments that you leave if you don't agree with what I'm saying here. Again, I challenge you to prove me wrong on this verse. I really do. Your eyes will be opened up, and just maybe you won't think I'm a complete goofball about this stuff. Okay, thank you for viewing.